Okay, class, so this is the beginning of our Introduction to Illustrator lesson. I'm not going to review some of the stuff that we went over last time, but I am going to just make sure that everybody has an understanding of where things are in the software and how to use some of the basic tools. So some of the tools that I skip over, you'll see later on in the smartphone lesson that will follow this one. So I'm going to start with a basic RGB document, remembering my naming conventions. I'm going to make sure to put numbers at the end so that as I continue to make modifications, I'm always aware of which one is the latest one. I'm going to make two artboards. I'm going to have it oriented in portrait and the RGB color mode. So you see now here my two artboards, and you'll notice a slight difference when I click on each one. That's just telling me which artboard I have activated. So right now I'm using the selection tool. So I'm just going to jump ahead and put something on the artboard here so that you can see how this tool is used. So I can use this to move something around and scale it by selecting one of these anchor points here. So the ones on the side will scale it horizontally, ones on the top will scale it vertically, and then the corner ones will scale both directions. If I hold shift while I'm moving a corner anchor point, it will keep the dimensions the same throughout while I'm scaling it. So if I want to make something bigger but I want to keep it exactly the same dimensions, I can use that. Also, if you hover just above one of the corner anchor points, and even these other anchor points here, you'll be able to rotate. And the smart guides will tell you when you get to 90 degrees. You'll also be able to see as I'm turning, it's following my cursor, the degree of rotation that I'm changing it. If I hold shift while I'm rotating, it will snap to 45 degrees, 90 degrees, 135, 180, and so on. Now this tool here is the direct selection tool. Also, you'll notice that when I hover here, they give me the hotkeys that I can use to switch between. So going from V, which is selection, to A, which is direct selection. This tool is similar to selection, except that it allows you to select individual anchor points. So when I hover here, you'll see the green word anchor shows up, and if I click it, at the top left here, you'll see the word anchor point. That's telling me that I've selected an individual anchor point and can move it independently of the other anchor points. So rather than moving the entire thing, which you can also do with this direct selection tool, when I've selected just an anchor point, I can move that independently of the other points. You can also move this with the arrow keys, and if you hold shift while you're moving with the arrow keys, it will move it at I think 10 times the rate or distance as without the shift key. So a note about the shapes, if you look at the top left here, it's telling me that I've selected a path and it's showing me two options for colors. So the left one here is fill, which is filling the shape with a particular color or even a pattern if I want. The one next to it is stroke, which is essentially the outline of my path or the outline of my shape, the connection of the anchor points. You can't see it right now since the stroke width is set to 1 point, which is the smallest unit it can be before it totally disappears. So if I increase this, you'll see what the stroke is and where it is. It's basically the outline of whatever my shape is. So the pen tool is one of the tools that you'll probably be using the most if you're doing any illustration. You can see that you can use it to create simple shapes or more complex ones depending on how you place your points. Now, as I get to this last point here, you'll see a circle appears next to my pen tool, and that is basically telling me that when I click here, it's going to close the shape. So as long as this shape is still open, the pen tool is going to continue to connect the dots. And once I close it now, it's going to basically allow me to start with a new shape. The other thing that the pen tool can do is allow me to control these points to make curves. So if I put a line here, put an anchor point here, if I click and hold down the mouse, I can drag this and it will create a curve for me. So it's placing these handles on either side of this second anchor point and creating a curve. So now if I use either the selection tool or the direct selection tool, I can grab one of these handles and actually change the shape of the curve after the fact. So after I've made my curve, I can still change it by pulling or pushing these handles. And again, with the direct selection tool, I can also always move the anchor points independently of the others. The text tool is relatively straightforward. You click somewhere on your artboard and type, and you can place text there. You can alter it with the same controls here in terms of the color, of fill, and of the stroke. You can scale it in the same way, rotate it. All of the controls that you have with any other path, you'll also have with the text tool. If you drag a box with this text tool, it will basically constrict your text to this box and not extend beyond it. I'm going to skip the line tool and jump to the rectangle tool. This is a fast way of making either squares or rectangles of any size or shape. And if you click and hold here, you'll notice on a lot of these tools there's a triangle in the lower right. If you press and hold that, it should bring up options for that tool. So the ellipse tool, and you'll see the hotkey here is L, is kind of nested within the rectangle tool. You also see the rounded rectangle, which basically is the same, but it gives me rounded corners instead of sharp corners. And again, these are all made up of anchor points. So if I want, I can move these independently or grab the handle and change the curve. And the other thing that you'll really want to get a handle of is basically moving around within the software. To actually move your view around, you'll be using the hand tool, which allows you to move the artboards around the screen, and the zoom tool. So I wouldn't suggest actually clicking on this tool and using it, but rather you can use the short keys, which are Control plus to zoom in, Control minus to zoom out, or what I think is even faster is holding the Alt key and rolling this scroll wheel. The other important part of the software that we'll be using is these icons here on the right side. So if you click on them, it will tell you here in the title what each of these are. So this is allowing you to select the color as a shorthand. Here's a color guide that's telling you shades and tints of the color that you're currently working with, and complementary colors that you can use along with the one you have selected. These are swatches, which by default will show you these colors, but you can also add new colors. So if you have a particular color scheme that you like, or colors that you found that you want to use over and over, you can, after you've selected that color, say this color for example, I can click this button here and it will save that color to my swatches. Here you have different types of brushes, symbols. These are options for the stroke, so you can make the lines dashed. You can determine the length of the dashes, the space in between the dashes. These are the caps, so what the ends of the shape will look like. Will they be sharp or will they be rounded? Here's a gradient tool, which lets you make a gradient as opposed to a solid color. Transparency will change the opacity of whatever you have selected. And this is probably the next most important one that we'll be using, is the layers. So we'll get into layers in the next lesson, but that's it for the intro to Illustrator and the basic tools and navigation of the software.